Welcome back, everybody, to Speaking of Meaning, Better Communication, Greater Impact. Today, I'm joined by Howard J. Ross and Jake Ross. This is a special moment for me because Howard J. Ross is one of the world's leading experts when it comes to bias, diversity, and inclusion. And he doesn't know this, but he is the reason why I started working in the field of diversity, trust, and bias. And Howard has written several books. One of my favorite books is Everyday Bias, Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgments in Our Lives. And it is the best seller according to Washington Post. His work has again inspired me, and in almost every workshop, every training, every speech, I include his work. And I'm excited for this conversation. I'm also joined by Jake Ross, and Jake has a master's in applied psychology, and he focuses on belonging in the workplace. And he is also the CEO and founder, Belong Together. And he's also the chief operating officer of an AI startup. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Ibrahim, thank you so much. What a lovely, lovely introduction. I think my father would have loved it. My mother would have even believed some of it. So I appreciate that. Really, I tell you, at this stage of my life, it does mean something to know that the work is out there and people like you are using it. So really, I deeply, deeply appreciate that.
Thank you. It's an honor to have you here, Howard, and you have inspired me so much. I'm excited for this conversation. I have a lot of questions for you, by the
Me too.
way, just so
Good,
you know.
good. Bring it
Jake,
on.
welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure to be here with Howard, my father, who I will say his work in bias, and particularly his leaning towards belonging and the study of group dynamics, has also inspired me to be here. Although it's kind of more of a direct line, so I guess I had a cheat code. But
Good to have you here
nonetheless,
as
I
well.
am. Yeah. Oh,
Go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, glad to be here.
Good to have you, Jake. All right, guys. So I'm going to start with Howard. Howard, you have decades of experience in this field. And if you could tell me, of all the experience you have, what have you learned or uncovered about bias as it relates to communication and decision making?
What's really funny, Ibrahim, because when I got into this field, I really stumbled into it. It wasn't, it's like I kept looking around and noticing the way people were behaving in ways that seemed so irrational, and it was a little bit like picking up a rock when you were a kid and seeing all the bugs underneath, and all of a sudden there was a whole world to explore there. I think it's by my nature. I think I'm a bit ADD, so by my nature, if you put me one place, I'm like, what about that, that, and that, and so here we are. I think there was one moment that I think captures it more than anything else. When I was doing the research for the book, this was probably back in 2012, 2013, of Everyday Bias I'm talking about now. I was sitting at a writing desk upstairs in my house, and where I was working a lot, and one day my wife came in and I was just sitting there staring, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I just read about the 100th study about bias, and I realize now that I have no idea what I think." And I think that was sort of the crystal of it, which is the way I say it is that people are not rational, we're rationalizing. And when we really begin to understand that, when we really begin to understand how much of our thinking, how much of our communication, how much of our reaction is just that, it's reaction, stimulus, spot, the response. Somebody presses that button on the jukebox and that song in our head begins to play. And at first that feels almost like hopeless, like, well, what chance do we have if we're that irrational? Was the first way it occurred to me. But then at some point I began to realize that if we really embrace that, if we really understand that and accept that that's there and begin to turn the inquiry inside as much as outside, to ask ourselves, where is that thought, that feeling, that reaction coming from, that can be liberating beyond anything we've ever experienced.
Mm. And I know you wrote in the book, Everyday Bias, we are not rational. Just like you mentioned, we are
Yeah.
rationalizing.
Yes.
And it is my favorite quote And this is exactly the one I use when I give presentations and trainings in bias and trust.
Yeah.
Because I
And
think we, just like you said before, I think we all believe we are rational. We make rational decisions, and most of the decisions we make are probably influenced by our unconscious bias.
well, there's no probably about it. They are. We know this for sure. And this whole way in West, particularly in Western civilization, the whole way we do this goes way back. It goes back to Plato, 2,500 years ago, who wrote in the Phaedrus dialogues. He talked about how emotion were the horses and rationality was the charioteer who kept the emotions in play. And so for
Mm,
2,500 years in our culture, we've worshipped at the altar of rationality. Are you sure you're being rational about it? Are you sure you're not being too emotional about that?
mm,
The problem is that when we really look at the way the brain works, what we realize is that emotion drives almost all of our decisions. And in
mhm,
a lot of cases, our emotional reaction to the things we're dealing with occur before we're even aware of them, before we even have any sense of consciousness about them. So we're already in the path of reaction before we even are realizing what's going on.
mm,
So it requires us to look at ourselves and to look at others in a different way.
mhm, mhm. This reminds me of Daniel Kahneman's book. I don't remember
Thinking
exactly
fast
the
and
title.
slow.
Thinking fast and
Thinking
slow.
fast and slow. Yeah.
Thinking Fast and Slow. I think he mentioned something about the fact that we make decisions based on emotions and we justify with logic.
Exactly. Exactly right.
Mm,
Jake, anything you want to add to that?
mm,
Yeah, it actually also brings to mind the work of Dan Ariely in Predictably Irrational, which sort of takes that behavioral economics standpoint to another level of looking at how can we reliably count on people to be unreliably rational, as it
mhm,
were,
mm,
or reliably irrational, I should say, and looking at this way that we can see how these biases survive because they're not being looked at, but the it's built into the way that we engage with the world because we have to respond, we have to react, we have to act before thinking. As Howard has often said, if a car is coming towards us, we don't think, "Oh, it's coming. What should I do?" We jump out of the way, and then all of a sudden are struck with this experience of, "Oh, wow, a car almost just hit me." When we have these biases baked into the to our worldview because they keep us alive, and our brain simply can't process the kind of information that would have us stay on top of every individual element of the world around us.
mm,
The problem is that the biases and in our worldview get baked very deeply into our systems for interacting with the world, which is how we come to biases influencing every individual relationship and interaction in our day-to-day lives.
mhm. And this is all at an unconscious level. So we're not aware of what is happening.
Yeah, not
Right.
only are we not only are we not aware, but we're very fortunate in a way that we react before we become aware, because if we were waiting for our awareness to kick in, it might be too late. Look, Kahneman gives a great example. He talks about you're driving in a car, the car in front of you hits its brakes and the taillights come on. If you were to go to your rational mind, what am I supposed to do now? Okay, you'd end up in the back seat of that car, right? But what happens is, for most people, your foot hits the brake pedal before you've even had
Mm,
a chance to
mm,
think, because over a period of time of driving, this is why, by the way, it's so important that young people who are learning to drive for that first 6 months or a year, drive particularly safely until they can build up that muscle memory. But for most of us who've been driving for a while, the red tail lights go on, the foot hits the brake, and
mm,
then we have a reaction response to what's going on after we've already saved our lives potentially.
mm,
So it's important for us to understand, like Jake said, that this is survival that's driving this.
mhm.
Go ahead, Jake.
I'd
Yeah.
just like to add one other piece, which is that that sort of perfectly depicts what underlies all of this work, which is that these biases, these experiences, they're practiced
Mhm,
and they are learned and reinforced over a long period of time, which means two things. One, it means that we are absolutely a product of our environment and that we can, there's a great, line in a song from a musical artist called Magic Giant. It says, "You want to change the world, but how's your hometown?" and this sense that we can broaden our worldview outside of the understandings that are baked into us as children
Mm,
is sometimes it's the reason why people uh, act one way as protest or politic and act another at home. But the other thing, and the really important piece to look at, and the reason why this work still matters, even though the world has its own evolving challenges with this kind of language, is
mm,
that things that can be learned can be unlearned and
mhm,
can have attention brought to them. As Carl Jung said, until we until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will rule our lives, and we'll call it fate.
mm,
And there's an opportunity there to bring to the present. Oh, I've learned that. Oh, that's old behavior. Or, as I'm sure the listeners can all relate to as a favorite, oh, that's my mother.
mm. So it sounds like we have to be aware, self-awareness.
Yeah, look, I think if we think about almost any mental health practice that anybody's ever taken on, whether it's therapy or transformational programs or, stuff that's built around spirituality, I can't think of any self-development program that doesn't include some element of turning that flashlight on yourself,
Mm,
as a good friend and teacher of ours, Michael Schiesser, likes to say. We live life with the flashlight pointing outside. We live life looking at that and looking at that. And, right, why did they do that? Why did they do that? I hate when they do that. But what we don't do is say, why does that trigger me? Why am I getting
mm,
so reactive to a simple comment that somebody made? Or why am I, so challenged by, or so frightened by, or so upset by, or why do I tend to diminish what that person says? We don't ask ourselves those questions. And often when we do, the light bulb can pop on. I never forget one day, my wife and I, Jake's mom and I, were in the kitchen, and she asked me, can you take out the trash? I have, just to be clear, I have no problem taking out the trash. I'm a big boy. I do that all the time. But for some reason, at that moment, I noticed I got ticked off at her. And I
mhm.
just stopped for a second because, like, there's no reason to be ticked off for her saying, "Hey, honey, would you mind taking out the trash?" Right? But I stopped, and as soon as I stopped, I saw it, and I laughed out loud. And she said, "What?" And I said, "No problem, Mom. I'll take it out." And I realized what had happened was my mother and I used to have these righteous battles over taking out the trash, right? So I became, at that moment, 7 years old. My wife became my mother. But fortunately, in the context of the notion that she also does this work with us, she knew exactly what I was talking about when I said that. And so when we begin to realize that, we really unlock the keys to our consciousness. I mean,
Mm,
it gives us the keys, I should say, to unlock our consciousness, to give us a view of how we're thinking, why we're thinking the way we are. And then when you look at people like Hahnemann or Ariely or some of the other incredible social scientists Sukhvinder Obi up in Canada, and people all over the world who we've studied with, um, they begin to give us a window into how that mechanism works, which makes it
mm,
more accessible to us. Just like when you know how a car works, you have a better way of dealing with operating a vehicle.
mm. This is very interesting, and I'm also curious, Jake, because I know you're a founder and CEO of Belong Together. Uh, it sounds like it is related to diversity, inclusion, bias as well.
Yeah. So I did want to correct one small piece from the introduction, which is that there is a small word missing in my background. My master's degree is in applied positive psychology.
Positive
So
psychology. Yeah.
yeah. So my work has sort of run in parallel to Howard's in a lot of ways, and it's converged more and more. But interestingly, so the source of mine is my focus is much more on in the realm of belonging and community inclusion. The
Hmm.
reason why is because I joined a uh, personal growth community, a group in when I turned 20. I was at a very low point in my life, and it was a community that's focused very much on community healing and lifting up people who need help so that we can help ourselves and help others. And it has been one of the most foundational elements of my life has been being a part of something bigger than myself, where I belong to something bigger. Now, I have three older brothers, but they're much older. It's a half brother and two stepbrothers. So I grew up after 2 years old, an only child.
Mm.
And as I'm sure you can imagine, knowing exactly how prolific my father's work is, he was very busy. And so, I got a lot of heart and a lot of emotion, but not a lot of time. And so I had this childhood wound of being lonely. And I had this frame that whatever happened in my life, the end all be all was going to be that I was going to feel better when I was a part of something bigger. And getting to do this kind of work as a child into adolescence, into early adulthood, alongside and even just participating or observing my mother and father's work. My mother is also a brilliant practitioner in the field as well,
Hmm.
though she's fully retired. But um, getting to witness that, I got to see what it looked like when people let down their guard, when they actually looked at the biases and the walls that they put up in between one another. So that sort of inspired my direction into studying psychology. But this group that I joined, sort of in the realm of recovery,
Hmm.
it helped me realize that belonging to something bigger than ourselves isn't just something that feels good. It actually
Mm.
inspired me to recognize that it's a foundational life force. And
Mm.
so when I ended up returning to college at 24 to study at UC Berkeley, I studied at the Greater Good Science Center and under Dr. Keltner in looking at belonging in the workplace, orienting towards the workplace outcomes that Howard and my mother Leslie were building their career around. And
Hmm.
so when it came time to look at these biases and these pieces, it all was just in my mind a another barrier to the interpersonal connection. So, fast forward now 10 years, having gotten my master's degree and worked in a variety of community gathering, community building, and event production roles, I've created this organization where my goal is very similar, but with a slightly different language, which is that much like the relationship of positive psychology to clinical psychology looks at healing, or someone once described it to me as clinical psychology is kind of like getting from a 1 to a 5, and positive psychology is kind of being more in the range of 6 to 10. So my work on community building and belonging is less oriented towards addressing systemic problems and systemic fractures. Not because they're not there, but because I think that there's an easier access point to opening people up to doing that deeper level work, which is to have them feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. And that in my career and in this particular adventure that I've been on with Belong Together looks like gathering for a purpose. So,
Hmm.
pardon me. One place that I tend to orient towards purpose-driven gathering is around music. Um, I love live music, and so I put on community-centric events where people can come together, and part of it involves a live music performance,
Hmm.
and so on. But at the foundational level, the thesis of my work is people are more effective, more productive, and more loyal to something larger than themselves than when they feel like they belong.
Hmm.
And that operationally speaking also looks like workplace coaching and team building and things of that nature.
Hmm. Do you meet every week, every month, or is it a daily program that they have?
So the work that I'm doing now is slightly more, I don't want to say sporadic. It's still building in its cadence. I currently produce, let's see, I have one I three events that I produce each month, essentially,
Hmm.
reliably, and then I also do direct coaching. And in my role, I am the COO. In fact, I was named the COO yesterday of an AI company. But part of that role also looks like facilitating our own inner
Hmm.
office
Hmm.
dynamics.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's all still building in its cadence, and it's all still coming into the world. I do some bigger events that have a lead time of 3 to 6 months.
Hmm.
There are particularly two festivals and one very large uh, gala that
Hmm.
happen once a year
Hmm.
each. But there's other. smaller pieces as well. But the truth is that I work with people at any time that I'm able to meet with them, because it really is what gives my life purpose, is to see people light up when they realize they're part of something bigger than themselves.
Hmm. And I can tell that that sounds like it's your passion. I can hear that, and I can see
Mm.
it as well, and I can feel it too.
Yes, sir.
Mm,
That's a big part of my why, and it's one of the
mm,
reasons why this project working with Howard has been such a delight, because as his area of interest has grown and evolved more in the direction of belonging, mine
mm,
has as well. And so we've gotten what started as we got to send each other articles that we could both share and enjoy, has ended
mm,
up in we actually get to collaborate and speak together and create presentations and do things like this with you.
mm. Great, great. You mentioned something interesting. You mentioned AI, and I know that you're working with the book Everyday Bias. You're writing a new edition, Howard, and you're co-authoring it with your son. Would you like to talk about that and tell me what
Sure.
will I, as a reader, expect from a new edition?
Sure. Well, there's some of it which is just really upgrading some of the research and following up on some of the stuff that, first looked at when the book came out originally in 2014. Um, in today's world, 11 years, or actually it'll be 12 years, because it'll probably be the summer before it gets actually out and the book actually gets released. So 12 years is an eternity given the world that we're living in right now. And so there's been a lot of new research. And so, a significant part of the book is just taking the essential, content of the book that was there before and upgrading it, bringing in new stuff, new research, upgraded studies. Some of the studies may have been debunked. So we want to get fresh studies to give us more better information. But I think the really exciting part of the book is the part that Jake really uh, was the point person I'm bringing in, which is to look at this new world of electronic communication and interaction that we're dealing with, and how do these biases that we see so prevalently in human interaction occur and impact us when they're on, for example, social media, when it is AI, and some of the stuff has been fascinating. I mean, I'll let Jake talk a little bit more about this, but just one example, for example, we found out that AI actually transfers bias to people more prevalently than other people do. And at first you think, how can you believe the machine rather than your friend more? But when you think about it, as is usually the case, when you step back and think about some of these results that you first say no to, there is some logic to it. There are two things in particular that affect this, not only two, but two in particular. One is AI is so obsequious. It's designed to make you feel good. It's designed to sound right, to sound confident, and to be nice to you. So there's no part of you that, the more you do it, the more you relate to it as a being as opposed to a machine.
Mm,
And it's funny. I just was listening to a story this morning on the radio about a new study that shows like the ridiculously high number of American young people, up to like 42, 43%, who are now using AI for friendship.
that's
They're,
sad.
because in their loneliness, that becomes their friend, right? So the one part of it is the obsequiousness, and the second part is we know it knows more than us.
Mm,
And so when you've got something that's nice to you and knows more than you, you're going to have a tendency to believe it more. And so we can kind of understand why. So when who is it? Musk's Grok went off the rails a couple of months ago and started calling itself Meta Hitler or whatever it was. People are watching that say, they get pretty deeply affected by it. And so that's just an example. But Jake, I'd love for you to talk about some of the other research that went into that,
mm,
particularly around
Yeah,
AI.
yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy to talk about this. Where to begin on that? Well, the first thing that I'll say is that it's interesting because when you refer to 11, 12 years being an eternity in the realm of diversity, equity, inclusion, and bias research in the world around us, 11 to 12 months is an eternity in the acceleration of AI and technology. And so I think that there's a lot of ideological pieces in the book that are going to be really important to and hold true. But it's also important to recognize that, for example, there's one particular piece where I talk about sycophancy in AI, which I promise won't be gone by the time that the book comes out. But there is a piece to it, which is we asked ChatGPT about to give an evaluation essentially of the chapter, and it responded with a sycophantic response, celebrating the critique of it as sycophantic. It was so on the nose that we quoted it, in fact. But the larger point to that is that that was GPT 4.1. We're now at GPT 5.2, and it's been 2 months since the manuscript went in. So it's really important to recognize before even going into any of these pieces that the speed at which AI is accelerating means that the ideological elements are more important than anything that are gonna refer to the actual practical capabilities of the technology. Now, that being said, before I dive in a little too much further, I would like to do a slight shameless plug, which is the reason why I enjoy working for the company that I do is that I work with a lot of really extraordinary thinkers and AI ethicists and safety, notable AI safety folk. And the tool that we're building, which is called the multiplicity.ai, actually runs a query through all of the frontier AI models and then summarizes the agreements and disagreements. So what it can do is it can help spot places where one is giving what looks like false information, whereas another three or four are giving what looks like true information. And it's not to say that any of it actually results in truth, but part of the reason why I feel very aligned working with the company that I work with while also doing this work on the side is that it actually does help create another layer towards mitigating bias in the way that we derive information from AI. And that tool is actually live now. But turning back towards the book and what people can expect to be different in this edition, I mean, the whole of what I just shared is a start. But one of the things that's really interesting to me as both a community builder in the world today and also a person in my 30s who grew up on the cusp of the growing age of virtual communicative technology is that what it means to be a member of community has foundationally changed in my lifetime. Now, certainly that's true of everybody that lives in the world today, and it will be true of everybody who ever lives in the world. As just a foundational point of fact, the way that technology is accelerating, everybody from now on, whoever lives on planet Earth will be able to say that what it means to be a member of the virtual world has changed in your lifetime. But particularly because of the dawn of social media having occurred around the time that I was an adolescent, I got to watch as social structures came apart and reoriented themselves into the sphere of a place like Facebook or Instagram. Pardon me. And part of what I talk about in the chapters that I contributed the most to is looking at how the algorithmic orientations towards allowing us to narrow the scope of the amount of information that we consume caused it to be easier to lean into, again, my apologies, cause it to be easier to lean into the way that these digital systems tell us what we want to hear and show us what we want to see and introduce us to who we want to be introduced to. And it holds steady across the observation of, we largely look at Facebook, but looking at Facebook and LLMs, large language models, or the chat-based AI that are most prevalent right now, people would prefer to hear what they want to hear, know what they want to know, and learn what they want to learn than be challenged to see that a different way. And one of the things that we see in the world at large is that the combination of the death of the third place, particularly as described by Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, but in general, that people are less likely to encounter and engage with one another face to face in an arbitrary in-person space, has people much more likely to conscientiously limit their exposure to differing ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing in AI, and the particular reason why I feel that this book is necessary reading for anybody who's engaging with an AI system in any form, which by the time this comes out will be a majority of the human race, if I had to guess. People need to recognize that you very easily can convince these tools to tell you exactly what you want to hear and form a coherent worldview based on confirmation bias.
Mm.
And the ease of access to information and the limitation on checking our own biases has us continue to nourish that. And without examining those biases, and I'll turn it back to you, Howard or Ibrahim, around how we examine those biases, but without examining those biases and without examining our inclination towards the self-fulfillment of confirmation bias, we end up living in a world that doesn't mirror reality.
Mm.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that the thing that's really startling, Ibrahim, and you can hear it in some of the things that Jake's saying, is the generational shift that this has created in a remarkably short period of time, um, that profoundly impacts almost every part of people's life experience. How often do I go out? Who do I go out with? What does friend mean? How do I know if the people who I'm friends with online are even what they say they are? The
Mm.
same gender or any other identity. I mean, all of this stuff. How much time I have to spend engaging in certain activities. How much time do I spend looking at my phone? I remember when Jake was at the start of it, when Jake was probably about 12 or 13 or something, and or I don't know, maybe a year or two older than that. But he and a friend and my wife and I went somewhere, and the two of them were sitting in the back seat, and they're both on their phones. And at some point, either Jake turned to Mark or Mark turned to Jake and said, "Yeah." And I realized that they were three-way conversing with somebody else, weren't talking to each other except to acknowledge what was talking on the phone. And it was just, this is the nature. Of course, nothing unusual about that in today's world. But I think that what we don't understand is yet, and we're just beginning to understand it. There are people out there like Jonathan Haidt, for example, who's ringing alarm bells about this, is the impact this is happening on the very social order that Jake was addressing before, the sense of belonging, the sense of genuine, true connectedness. Like, what
Mm-hmm.
does it really mean to belong? Does it mean having 10,500 friends on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever? I mean, is that really belonging to something? In some cases, it can be. I have communities online that I'm a part of, which are deep and rich, and people really engage in real life conversations, and are as powerful as getting together, in some cases with a group every week. And then there are others which are people pretending a lot and talking, but not actually sharing a lot. And so I think it requires us to be much more discerning. And I think one other aspect of this that's really important is, of course, the core issue I think that all of us are dealing with, which is the lack of a central source of truth anymore. When I
Mm-hmm.
grew up, if the New York Times or the Washington Post said something, I'm old enough to remember Watergate, for example, or the Pentagon Papers or things like this.
Mm-hmm.
When the Post or the Times or they printed something, people on the other side politically didn't like it. They didn't like the fact this information was getting out, but it wasn't called fake news. It wasn't just discarded and
Mm.
pretended like it wasn't real. But now, of course, when we go online and you can get, an AI thing to give you a fact, which may not even be a fact. I mean, because it's not always right. They make mistakes.
Mm.
Sometimes they draw from an article that was posting false information, and yet they use that as a source to draw from. So the tool that Jake's company is working with is going to be, I think, really essentially helpful because it will help us cut through all that and get to the point where we have a much greater chance of discerning what's actually going on, what's the actual information that's out there, that we can base this on, and not different interpretations of it based on how a particular AI might have been programmed or who gave the input to it.
Mm. Is it fair to say that the project you're working on, is it some kind of a fact checker as well?
It has that quality. I think it's important to to be conscientious about using the word fact uh, without very specific substance, because facts are facts, and uh, information that we gather from AI does not always mirror facts. Now, it does have the quality that by asking multiple systems at the same time the same question, we can see if three or even four LLMs say the same thing or agree on the same foundational point, then one can reasonably assume that it is certainly much closer to the truth, or rather, as I'm more fond of saying, much further from falsehood than what would be the case if it was asked of a single system. And this is important because, even while writing the book, we used ChatGPT to do a number of research tasks, and we had to check our work because there were times, particularly in asking for it to find quotes for us, when it hallucinated quotes, and in fact fabricated and misattributed quotes to authors that we
Wow.
had to double check the work on. So again, with fact and as I've become fond of saying, objective truth ain't what it used to be.
Hmm.
And it's really important to say, like, yes, this could be used as the multiplicity could be used as some form of fact checker, but only but it can only be called that when the output can be verified as fact, if that makes sense.
Mm.
The idea being that we love the idea of getting it closer to the truth, but we're not claiming that we can deliver on truth, nor should any of the AI firms that are out there be doing so as well. Either,
Mm.
excuse me, be doing so
Mm.
either.
This is fascinating. I'm looking forward to. Did you say in the summer, Howard?
Yeah, the book will
The
be coming out
summer.
in the summer. Yeah,
All right, all right. I'll make sure I get a copy of that.
yeah, great.
Howard, in the book Everyday Bias, I know a new edition is coming. Uh, if I, I did some research. I've read your stuff, and your work bridges neuroscience and social science. And so my question to you is, what do our brains do when we encounter different perspectives or people we assume are different? And
Like,
how does that
sorry.
affect communication and meaning?
Wow, that's a deep question, and I think it's really at the heart of, I think, human communication. First of all, I think um, we have to recognize that we are fundamentally oriented towards safety. It is for obvious reasons. Survival is the most important thing we got going for us, right? So we're fundamentally oriented towards survival. So any difference that occurs as threat to us, the threat response will be the first thing we'll feel. In fact, there's some research that shows that it takes as much as 20% more biological energy, more glucose production, more brain energy production for us to see something positive than something negative. In a way, you can get that. It's like, okay, let me make sure it's safe before I can engage, right? Because
Mm,
we want to stay safe. And so, the nature of what happens when we encounter something that's different from us is we sort out where we can be safe to it and where we can connect. Now, one of the reasons that's so important for us to understand today is because the binarization of society that we're dealing with, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. We've moved from, I like to say, we've moved from a bell curve society where most people are sort of, we're sort of issue oriented. I'll use US terms here just because those are the political terms I'm more familiar with, but I might agree with somebody on civil rights and disagree on foreign policy, and agree with somebody on economic terms but disagree on something else. And that's for the most part the way we've operated, as that sort of bell curve. And then there were some people on the extremes. But what's happened, and there's data that shows this, what's happened over the course of the last 30, 40 years is we've moved now to what I call a dumbbell curve society, where everything's on the end and nothing's in the middle anymore. And we know that there was some extraordinary research that was done around this. It's called the outgroup homogeneity effect. And what it teaches us is that if you take two groups of people who are different, um, and you ask them to solve a problem, for example, you put them in the same room working together, they will have a tendency to be able to usually move towards compromise. But if you put them in separate rooms, they will
mm,
begin to identify everybody in that other room as being the same. In other words, all Republicans are the same. All Democrats are the same. And that will have a tendency to push people towards moving to the more extreme points of view.
Mm.
And so we're in this very weird place right now where we've got all this access to people and communicating with people that we've never had before in history, all the technology that we've been talking about. And yet at the same time, it seems to be moving us more and more into tribalism than it does bringing us together. And so I
Mm.
think that when we look at bias in that regard, it's a whole nother load of information to strengthen our biases. If I have a natural tendency to think that people who voted for a certain political person, for example, is a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
and then I begin to see everybody who voted for them as the same, then when the most extreme of those people does something, I then associate that with everybody, and it makes that bias
Mm.
more rigid, more solid. And we've seen this, of course. We've seen it here when people on the left think everybody who voted for Trump is like the people who marched in Charlotte with the tiki torches and the signs that said Jews will not replace us, and everybody on the right now says that everybody on the left is the same as the people who were, participating, saying anti-Semitic things in college protests against Gaza. It's like everybody gets thrown into those extreme buckets. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously that makes it much harder for us to reach each other. Jake, I think you
Mm.
have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that, and we talk about this in the book as well, that there's a companion part to the outgroup homogeneity effect as well, which is social identity theory.
Mm-hmm.
And social identity theory sort of works the other direction, which is that outgroup homogeneity effect is that you, who exist in that group that is not mine, all look and behave a certain way. And then there's the other side, which is social identity theory, inclines us to see the same in the people that we identify with. And one of the things that we see, particularly referring to American politics, and it's been interesting, interesting, particularly in the different spaces that we occupy, because I live in the Bay Area in California, which is this, relatively speaking, quite a liberal bubble. Whereas Howard lives in Virginia, which has a very different socioeconomic and sociopolitical landscape. So it's interesting because one of the things that happens in spaces that I occupy is that I see this sense of we are all this and they are all that, the outgroup
Mm.
homogeneity effect. And then when I go visit my family, I start to look at how there are people, and we go visit DC proper as well. And there's a lot of frustration, actually. In fact, I would, in my experience, even more so frustration on the moderate right, excuse me, of people who very actively are told who they are. And people, or in this particular example, people who voted for Trump are told that they carry the characteristics of all of the worst characteristics of any person who represents that group in any way, shape, or form. When in the reality, a lot of people, particularly on the moderate right, a lot of people are single issue voters.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this quality there where the outgroup homogeneity effect actually increases the influence of social identity theory, because if a whole group of people to whom you may actually think you belong more, or at least to some extent, tells you you don't belong here, you belong there with them, then all of a sudden this deep foundational need that we as human beings have, and it's built into our genetics as far back as giving birth to hyper vulnerable offspring that need to be cared for in community. But if they tell me that I belong there and I don't feel that I belong anywhere else, then I will start to identify inside of a group where I feel a sense of belonging. And over a long enough period of time, my beliefs stop becoming more important than the beliefs of the place that feels like home to me.
Yeah, Ibrahim,
Oh.
I can share a story with you. But something actually happened that kind of points to this a bit. For about
Go
10
ahead.
years, for about 10 years, I did a monthly radio show on National Public Radio about workplace and diversity related issues. And I did one of the shows one day. I forget what the topic was we talked about that day, but I got back to my office and I get a phone call. And this guy says to me, he says, listen, I was wondering if I could bend your ear a bit. He said, he described himself as a 50-ish year old white guy. He's a computer programmer or some kind of, tech related job. He said he'd been liberal his whole life. Um, but he had gotten concerned lately because there were some layoffs in his company, and he was the one who let go, and they kept a lot of younger Asian practitioners, I guess. And so he had concerns about this, and he wrote a piece about this, like a blog, just what it was to feel like this 50-year-old white man. Is this the end of the time for me? And he sent me the blog, and it wasn't by any means overtly racist or anything. It was really, he was expressing his concern. What's his role in society moving forward? Well, somehow people in the American Nazi Party got a hold of this blog and posted it on their site, and it became one of the most popular blogs of that particular period of time. And all of a sudden, he had all of these people reaching out to him and wanting him to engage. And
Wow.
and he called me because he said, when I was hearing you speak, and I think I was talking about belonging at the time. He said, when I was hearing you speak, I could feel like I'm feeling myself getting sucked into this community, this place where I know I don't agree with them, but it feels so good that I'm getting all this acknowledgement.
Mm.
And I think that this is exactly the way it happens. We need to have a home. We know now that Maslow was wrong, that the lowest rung of the ladder is not survival. The lowest rung of the ladder is actually belonging, which is why we know things like suicide bombers. Obviously, if survival was the lowest rung, nobody would be a suicide bomber. But if giving your life for the good of the greater good, the greater community, is a sign of belonging, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and like Jake said, I mean, we learn this when we're bored, because as babies, immediately we know that if we don't belong to somebody, we die. I mean, it doesn't take long for us to realize that that person, whether it's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, or the orphanage, somebody's got to be taking care of us for us to survive. And so
Mm.
we can see how, if we divide the world into thems versus us's with no bridge in between, and then we know that everybody has to fit somewhere, then by demonizing everybody over there, we give them no choice but to go over there. And that's
Mm.
why it's so important, as we try to bridge this gap in our society. We can't do it with everybody. There are going to be some people who we're just not going to be able to reach, and some people who we're going to be too triggered by to want to reach. We're
Mm.
human beings. I don't see the Dalai Lama sitting here. Um, but that we know that if that's the case, then we need to stop for a second and say, okay, where's the humanity in that person? Even though I think their ideas
Mm.
might be completely stupid, completely wrong, even immoral, there's still a human being over there who's having these thoughts and ideas. And even if you look at, somebody who's, obviously President Trump is the easiest one for people to point to, but you could also look at this and look at his environment growing up and say, clearly he had some difficult challenges to deal with in dealing with his own father. And there are times when we can be, now that doesn't mean it allows for any behavior to be justified any more than a rabid dog is fine just because it's sick. No, it's still
Mm.
dangerous, right? The fact
Mm.
that it's sick is the cause, but it's still dangerous. But nonetheless, I think it gives us a greater chance to reach people and to realize, like Jake said, that an awful lot of people do not vote based on agreeing with the other person. They just agree with that person more than they agree with the other choice that they had. So when I wrote my last book, Our Search for Belonging, I interviewed over 100 people who voted for President Trump in the first election, and 54% said they voted more against Hillary Clinton than they did for Trump, as an example. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that they liked him; they just liked her less. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that I think it's important for us, when we look at this from the standpoint of how people interact, that this being pulled into a point of view in order to fit in is a huge impact on us.
Mm-hmm. And so once we are pulled in and we identify with the group, over time, do we start behaving like the most extremes in the group?
Well, we may not end up behaving like the most extremes, but we certainly end up, um, often justifying the extreme behavior. We find a
Mm-hmm.
way to, because human beings are rationalizing and not rational, right? So here I am. I'm now associated with this team. A member of my team does something that's appalling. I can't say that was appalling, because that would be a break from me from my team. So instead, I say something like, "Oh, I didn't read the story yet," or you see it in these politicians all the time. Well, I didn't hear the actual quote, or I didn't see the actual story, or well, they said it a little differently than I would say. It's sort of like, I don't want to talk about this movement all that,
Mm.
because I'm in this quandary. I have to belong to this group in order to survive, but belonging to this group means that I have to accept certain things that I know are wrong, and
Mm.
that could occur on both sides of the equation.
Mm. it surely does, because I remember when I used to live in the U.S. and something would happen. Let's say President Obama back then would give a speech. I would put on Fox News, and you would hear a totally different story, and then you would put on CNN. It would be completely different, as if we're living in two different complete worlds.
We are, in fact. It's like you sometimes you say, "What color is the sky in your world?" It just it feels that it feels different because, like you said, and I did that for a long period of time. I actually used four different stations. I used CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and BBC.
Mm,
And I would follow stories over a period of time. And you're absolutely right. It was just staggering, staggering.
mm,
Not only the stories that were covered, but what was not even talked about. When
mm, mm.
sometimes one station is spending half their show talking about a topic that doesn't even show up on the other station. So
Yeah, yeah. And even before you watch the channel, you already know the the perspective they're gonna have on a certain topic or a certain speech, for instance.
yeah, and that's I think one of the challenges that we have in our current environment because it used to be ABC, NBC, CBS here in the States was pretty. It was all pretty much the same news. They didn't vary within 5 degrees of each other. Huntley Brinkley was a little bit more conservative than Walter Cronkite was back in the day, but we're talking about you know 5 percentage points maybe. And of course, the economic model behind it was you were speaking to the marketplace. You wanted to get as much as the marketplace as possible. So you didn't want to piss off half the marketplace by taking a strong position one way or the other. And on top of that, of course, it was generally considered to be unethical in those days for news people to have a point of view, unless it was specifically said, this is an editorial. And they would have these guys come on at the end and they have a white shirt and a tie and they say, this is an editorial. Now, of course, because the economic model has changed, cable news does not need the whole marketplace. All they need is like 22% of the marketplace in order to have a big win financially. And they know that the best way to keep that and get that loyalty for that marketplace is to throw them red meat, throw them stuff that they really want to hear, that they're really going to believe in. And of
Mm,
course, none of that gets mitigated in most cases by another point of view. And so we get more and more and more this sense of a different reality that you're talking about.
mm. So gentlemen, if so far we've talked about bias and uh, the idea that bias is quote unquote natural. We all have bias. And so, how can we reconcile that idea that bias is something we all have natural with the aspiration to communicate with fairness, respect, and depth? I'll start with Jake.
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, it's interesting. One of the things that I see a lot of is that our biases. So, as we've talked about, our bias for car slams the brakes, we slam the brakes. This is just a biased orientation towards survival, and at its core, most of it is. And now, what survival means is a little bit different because what we know from brain scans is that the region of the brain that activates when we feel physical pain, which is, Howard, if you would please.
The dorsal posterior insula.
Thank you. I never remember that one. The dorsal posterior insula becomes active when we experience physical pain, and it also becomes active when we experience social pain and social
Mhm.
isolation. And so it's an interesting environment that we live in where the experience of fear, of fight or flight, and of the somatic experience of not feeling, of feeling pressed for survival is not exclusive to, by any measure, to things that are actually dangerous. And what we find is that our biases that would otherwise be reserved towards life and death situations get allocated to what our somatic experience of life and death situations are. Now, for the brain in particular, that makes sense to us because in the evolutionary environment, without tribe, we would die. And so it's one of the cornerstones of my inspiration for the work that I do is this quality that we have as human beings to be biologically oriented to belong. And there's a great deal of study of molecular cellular biology, oxytocin, dorsal, the brain, all of these different ways that we notice that our bodies are oriented towards survival. Now, coming back to your question of how do we show up inside of these biases, one of the things that happens in the world today is that this is particularly true of people in more liberal spaces, which is that when people make a social faux pas, it is treated as dramatically more egregious than it is, and there's a lot less compassion for it. Now, that's not to say that there should be compassion in certain places. Abject racism, I'm sorry, I don't have compassion for it. I just don't. I can recognize humanity and not have compassion for a person who declares a person less than another. However, if a person makes a microaggression or says something that is offensive at some level that they don't understand, it's very important to recognize. I mean, I do stuff like this sometimes too. It's really important to recognize that people are trying our best to celebrate and acknowledge people in a way that has them feel human. But, it's important to remember that when you look at a person, you're looking at every teacher they've ever had and every experience that's ever made them believe a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm sort of dancing around this question, but to directly answer the question, from my point of view and my opinion on this and my belief is that the way that we combat these biases in the world is that when they emerge, we treat them in both ourselves and in others with compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's a really core element to recognize, which is that most people want to love each other. And when an orientation comes elsewhere, it is most often fear. Now, the layers of that fear are very different, but if we can be with a person who is, oh, I said this thing, it comes from a bias, this is my learning, this is where I learned this thing. I would like to be better. I would like to be different. I would like for you to feel safe, and I would like the feedback. If we can treat that with compassion, then people will come to understand that those biases aren't keeping us safe anymore. And once we can do that, it stops being, oh, I can't say the wrong thing for pain of being ostracized. And it starts to be, oh, that's an old pattern. Thanks for catching that. I'm going to work on that.
Mm.
And the other side is that then you have to work on it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think you can hear in what Jake's saying that, as an old teacher of mine used to say, everything always starts and ends with awareness. So imagine this for a second. Do you have any children, Ibrahim?
I do 3.
You do. Yeah, you had 3 children. Okay, so you've had days like this, I'm sure. We all have. Any parent has. Have a tough day at work. You're busy as hell. Maybe something not particularly pleasant happened. And you come home and all you want is your chair, the newspaper, and a glass of wine, and leave me alone. But you walk in the door and your kids are there, daddy, 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 right? They're reaching up their arms. Now there are times when we forget who we are and we just tell them, just leave me alone, go play, But for most of us, we hope that what we could do at those moments is to stop and say, okay, I know I'm in a crummy mood. It's not their fault. They're my babies. And all of a sudden we hit a switch when we do that. When we get that awareness, that reaction lessens up. And there's actually, interestingly enough, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said, what we can observe, we are not. And that by the very fact that we are watching ourselves react, I'm saying to myself, okay, I'm taking my bad day and I'm putting it on my babies. I've pulled myself out of the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. I'm now sourcing myself in the observational aspect of the brain, the neocortex of the brain. And that discharge of energy then softens. The amygdala is that reactive part. When you're hysterical, it's likely historical, right? But when we get more aware, we can say, okay, I notice that my machine is reacting, but I don't have to let it run me. It's a little bit the metaphor I often use. It's like stepping on the clutch in a standard transmission automobile. If when you step on the clutch, the motor doesn't stop running. The motor is still buzzing away. It's just not moving the car forward anymore. And so awareness allows us to do that. Say, okay, clearly something's triggering me. Let's say I go into an interview
And I walk into the interview, I meet the person for the first time, and I have that thought, something about this person I don't like. Now, that's happened to everybody, right? You meet somebody, you have that. Now, if I'm aware, I could stop and say, okay, stop, time out for a second. I might even say to the person, you know what, I'll be right back. I just forgot something. Step outside, check in with myself, and say either, who is this person reminding me of? Because I haven't even said anything yet. So it can't be them, right? Who is this
You don't
person
know them.
reminding? That's right. Who is this person reminding me of? And even if I can't think of that, I could say, they're clearly reminding me of somebody or something. Let me take a breath and be with them instead of that. And that doesn't mean it's going to fix it 100%, but it makes it much more likely that we could be with the person in front of us rather than projecting whoever we were projecting onto that person when we first met them. And so that's
Mm.
where awareness and taking those times, that's why in the book we talk about the pause model, which is an opportunity to stop and look at what's going on and ask ourselves a few questions that gives us a chance to say, okay, maybe it is appropriate to be nervous here with this person. Maybe it is appropriate to be especially safe with this person, or maybe there's no reason to assume that. But it gives me at least a much greater chance to be able to see that and to be the one who gets to make the decision, as opposed to it
Mm.
happening just automatically.
Hmm. So, uh, is it is it harder to be self-aware and to pause and ask yourself questions? And when you are tired, scared,
Yes.
um, exhausted, and so forth?
Objectively, yes.
Mm.
Objectively, yes. It's also harder when the particular reaction you're having is tied into a deep trauma in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if you have a woman who's been sexually abused or traumatized, then we know that that's a huge percentage of women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Something that happens in that domain may have a stronger reaction to
Mm-hmm.
her than the exact same thing happening to somebody who hasn't had the previous experience.
Mm-hmm.
That we each have our own, internal mechanism that's been designed over the course of our lives to deal with survival in certain circumstances. And so it's why, I remember, we used to do these exercises in the early days of doing diversity training, and we would have people share a story in their life, something that had happened at a time when they felt different, when made them feel less than. And people would often talk about things, like getting parents getting divorced or obviously racial or gender, all kinds. One time this woman starts to share, and she was a very highly accomplished person in this particular company. And she starts to share that her thing was that when she was a kid, she was left-handed, and when she was a kid, it was still in the times when they used to force left-handed kids to write with their right hand. This was back, just before my time that stopped, like I remember my father talking. And she's weeping openly and talking about the fact that because of this, she had to get she had gotten a B in handwriting. It was the only time she didn't get an A in her whole college and her whole high school experience or her whole whatever school experience. And clearly, dramatically upset over being left-handed versus right-handed. Not exactly the kind of thing that we put high on the level of, identities that cause people to be excluded. And yet for her, that was a traumatic incident. So I
Mm.
think it's important for us to recognize that we each, you can't externally look at these things and think you understand why they're affecting people the way they are.
Mm. Mm.
But we can be sensitive and compassionate, as Jake's saying, to that there's something going on there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one other great example, Stephen Covey in his book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about being on a train one night. A guy gets on with three kids and they're running around and wreaking havoc and pulling people's newspapers. And the guy's just staring straight ahead and doing nothing. And Covey finally loses his temper with the guy and says, why don't you take care of your kids? And the guy says, yeah, we just left the hospital and their mom died and I just don't know what to do. And he
Mm.
talked about all of a sudden, he shifted from frustration to complete compassion for this man
Mm.
and for the children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So understanding each other's stories, and this is where the work that Jake does with his community gatherings, where not only their people aren't just getting together to sing music, they interact with each other, they do
Mm.
exercises, they do, they it's like a workshop, where people
Mm.
are being more intimate with each other
Mm.
and getting to know each other more. And that's what we're all looking for. We're looking for that sense of belonging with people around us.
Mm. Anything you want to add, Jake?
No, I think that really does sum it up. Obviously, Howard is more experienced when it comes to the specific topic of bias. My frame of reference for this often tends to be more on the side of compassion. As I mentioned, a lot of what exists in my life, I owe to a recovery community where the whole narrative is it doesn't matter what you've done, it doesn't matter where you've been, you can belong here and be a part of something. And it's often said in that particular world, we're here to help love you until you can love yourself.
Mm, that sounds
So
beautiful.
it is, yeah.
Mm,
And that's why after 11 years, I still keep coming back. Um, but most of my frame lives within this space of, um, no matter who a person is or what they've done, they are still human.
they're still human.
And sometimes it can be more difficult to be face to face with that because human beings can do really awful and tragic things. And also, it is a human being who is doing that. And there are
Mm,
always layers, always.
yeah. I think we need more of this perspective in this world right now because it seems like we're so divided. Watching the news, and I know you've also talked about it, Howard, how politicians talk to each other. Back in the days, we would disagree on certain issues, but nowadays, if I'm disagreeing with you, you're not only not competent, you're also the enemy. And we need more of that right now, compassion and seeing the human in one another.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we've gotten to the point where um, that lack of compassion, that sense of cruelty, even, is celebrated um,
Mm,
by people. I mean, I hate to get political about this, but this incident that just happened this past week with this American producer director Rob Reiner being murdered, and President Trump's reaction, which even people on the Republican side have been appalled by. But it's like you look at this, you say, never in history would an American president state make a statement like that. I mean, literally, we had a civil war for God's sakes, but there never would an American president do something like that. There's just a certain level of civility we expect from people at that high level of government, and yet we've gotten to the point where that happens. Now, again, he's not singular. I'm not suggesting he's the only one. It's just a glaring example right now. But I think that this is unfortunately where we are right now, where show them how tough you can be, show them how mean you can be, becomes currency of value, and I think that's very sad at a time when we need kindness more than ever.
mm. Do you think we've been getting used to that it doesn't bother us anymore?
I think this is a problem. Is that I think we do get numb to it. How many times can you get outraged by the same thing? And I think, when we live in an environment which has become an outrage festival. I mean, I've pretty much stopped watching the news. I follow the news every day. I get news streams, and I intentionally get news streams from different sides of the political spectrum. But TV news has become nothing but an outrage factory, a 24/7 outrage factory. So unless there's some live event happening that I want to see, speech somebody's giving or election night or something like that, we generally don't watch the news. We generally get our
Mm,
news through various different sources because it's
mm,
more dependable and it's less outrage oriented. I mean,
mm,
there's so much of the way the news is being designed now. It's not by accident. It's being designed this way because they have people who are studying what causes people to emotionally react and therefore get more tied into your station. And so that's being done on both sides of the political spectrum. And we know there are
mm,
alternatives. Here in the States, PBS NewsHour is out there. Everybody says, I wish we could have someplace where they just told us the news. That's what they do, but nobody watches. So it's this dichotomy between what we think we want, but what we also respond to is different.
mm, mm. So basically, we're only exposed to things we want to hear
That's right.
and things that confirm our own biases and deeply held beliefs.
That's right. We live in an echo chamber of our own making and participation.
Mm. And just
Yeah.
like on Facebook or social media,
Yeah.
if I don't like a post or if I don't like somebody's opinions, I can just unfollow them and just follow
Mhm.
people I agree with.
And over
Right.
time, the algorithm is designed to have you see only things you agree with or
Mm,
overwhelmingly things you agree with, Coach.
mm,
Yeah, well, and I think, pardon me, and I think that there's a really important thing to look at with that as well, which is that
The light here.
which is that they're feeding each other. This choice of how we engage with confirmation bias and it becoming so easy. Um, John Haidt talks about this in The Coddling of the American Mind. We've become so sensitive to things that elicit discomfort, and the reason why is because they're so easy to avoid. And all of a sudden, things that were now there's a trade-off, right? We used to be a lot more comfortable with things that really didn't have a place in our world at all. Certain ideologies, viewpoints, even certain language. However, in avoiding those things entirely, and like you're saying, we choose to unfollow somebody who we don't like, all of a sudden our worldview gets very, selective. And it's important to recognize that I make the joke, objective truth ain't what it used to be, but there's also this really important distinction, which is that there is so much more information in the world. So much more of the world is publicized. We can see, we can hear, we can engage with, we can talk to so much more of the world than we've ever had access to before. And it's continuing to increase to the point that, we're building onto these online spaces where people spend their whole lives.
Mm.
I mean, I had a friend who I was a groomsman in a wedding with another person who had only met the groom 3 times in person. But they played video games together online every single day. And the third time they had met in person was when he came to be a part of the wedding. So,
Wow.
we're part of a much bigger world, and part of the human lens of consumption of information is that we can only understand so much, you know. And when we're blasted with these bits of information, particularly when those pieces of information are advertisements that are tailored to what our online profile thinks that we want to see, there's less space to really review the practical humanity of what's around us.
Mm.
Jake, maybe it might be helpful to take a minute and just talk about Barry Schwartz's work on the paradox of choice and how that impacts it.
Sure. I mean, the very short answer is that we get decision paralysis. Barry Schwartz, who was actually a guest lecturer during my time in grad school and is a consistent partner of my grad program, really cool guy. He writes about the paradox of choice and decision paralysis in the sense that when we have a choice between 1, 2, even 3 things, it's a lot easier for us to have an understanding. But as uh, the amount of things that we need to choose from grows and bombards us at every level. Where do you want to go to school? Okay, what does that mean about the socioeconomic environment of the place that you're going to live when you get there? How does the meal plan affect your health? How does that set you up for X level of job? Oh, this job is interesting, but is that even going to be here in 3 or 4 years because of the advancements of technology and the way that things are going? And by the way, instead of doing all of that, there's all of these other options for who I can be in the world and online that don't necessitate a college loan and all of these things. And I use college in
Yeah.
particular because I live in a college town. But the idea being that um, the more the more we are experiencing what people would call freedom to choose, the less free we actually are to be a part of the lives that we want to live because we're so
Mm.
overwhelmed by how we direct our attention at any given moment. And the fact is that that level of overstimulation, as programmed by the people who build and uphold our society, is not going anywhere because it's too advantageous.
Mm.
Yeah, so put that in the context of absorbing information now that's happening, just what's happening in the world on a daily basis. When I was growing up, and my number would be 75 in January, but when I was growing up, you had a newspaper that came in the morning, a newspaper that came in the evening. You had a half an hour of news in the morning and a half an hour of news at night, and then occasionally magazines, Newsweek, Time, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
That was it, really, for the most part, unless you were somebody who studied a field.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty easy to look at that information that's there, and glean what's going on and know which side you're on. Um, but it's also pretty easy to allow all of that information in because it's not an odious amount. A half an hour morning, half an hour at night, read the paper with breakfast, read the paper with after dinner, whatever. But now we've got thousands of times more information available to us. It's not possible. It's not even conceivably possible for anybody to even read a fraction of it on a daily basis. So what people will do is they will try to simplify that choice. Now, how do I simplify that choice? One way to do that is I'll go to this source, this Substack, or this person's writing, or this magazine, whether it's The Atlantic or Breitbart or whatever you particularly like. They become my default. I let them choose the stories that I should see. Now, that's fine if it's something like the magazine This Week, which is designed to pull in, or 1440 is an online source like that, where these are news sources that are designed to say, here's what these people are saying, but here's what these people are saying, and give you a sense of both. But unless you've chosen one of those, and sadly, like the PBS comment I made earlier, not a lot of people use those sources. What people will go to is, I like The Atlantic because I'm liberal and The Atlantic really schools Trump, or I like Fox because I'm conservative and they really schooled Obama, or, and so our choices get simplified because they're easier, but they're also less fulsome and more reinforcing of our already point of view.
Yes. And then we go to work and we find diverse environments. And gentlemen, I know our time is running out, but I would like to talk to you about, I would like to talk to you about the book, Reinventing Diversity.
Okay.
Why did you write that book?
Well, I wrote that book back, let me say, started doing the research for that book probably 10 years before I wrote it. It was my first book. And what I found was I got into the diversity space. I've been doing this work for more than 40 years now. When I first got into the diversity space, the way we did the work was, well, I used to call them find them and fix them trainings. You come in a room and it's like, who's the racist, who's the sexist, and how do we fix you? Not very effective, well-intentioned, but not very effective, right? And what I began to realize was that, first of all, that this was more than just a social justice issue, that there really were deep business implications to this, deep societal implications for this, beyond just fairness, in terms of getting the best out of our people, giving people the opportunity for success in life, helping people in terms of their health and well-being, lots of different things. And I began to notice that there were certain things that just seemed wrong-headed to me. One was that this notion that diversity was something that needed to be was a problem that needed to be fixed, as opposed to a body of distinctions that it was valuable to understand. So, for example, you're in Sweden. I've done work in Sweden, as I've shared with you. Before I went to Stockholm to do work there the first time, I think I was there twice. I took some time to go online to understand Swedish business practices. And are there any cultural patterns that I needed to know, that, things that were particularly liked or particularly offensive in that culture when doing business? Because, that was where I was going. If you're going to France, it's helpful to learn to speak a few words in France, so understanding these differences impact the way we interact with each other. So the first aspect of it was this whole notion of understanding it as culture, and understanding the different aspects of culture that different people bring, and how do we learn to work together across these cultures in a way that sometimes could benefit us, because this group brings something that we don't have, and we bring something that they don't have, right? So that was the first aspect. The second aspect was very at the heart of what we've been talking about, which was the whole unconscious bias conversation, which at the time, 15 years ago, was really only being spoken about in the academy. There wasn't much in the way of diversity practitioners weren't talking about it. But for me, it was the key that unlocked the door in a lot of ways. Why it was that good people did bad things. Why it was that people who were so intelligent and so rational could say things that were so startlingly dumb. And so when I got that, it really shifted also this notion that what's driving that person is that they're a bad person, which is kind of the way in the early days we were taught to do this work was, if you teach everybody to be a good person, they'll do the right thing. But I started to see more and more good people who did things that weren't particularly on par, And so that was the second part of it. And then the third part was that a lot of diversity work at that time was being done through special activities, International Food Day in the cafeteria, Black History Month, Women's History Month, all these kind of special events. And there's nothing wrong with these special events. In some cases, they could be really valuable if they're used the right way. But what other business issue of import do we handle in that way? You know, if we have a safety issue, we don't just say, oh, put on a safety day. You know, we look at our systems, we look at our structures, we say, where's the lack of safety? How do we improve that safety? You know, if we start to look at these issues of diversity and identity that way, we say, okay, so let's study how we hire people. You know, what do we notice about our hiring patterns? We notice that, you know, 22% of the people who apply for jobs in our company are African American, let's say, but only 10% of the people who are hired are African American. So we need to explore that. Is that just coincidence? Could be. Could be that just happens that they were less qualified for the job, or it could be that this is a sign of bias. But by asking the question, we at least know where to look. So the whole idea of bringing a systemic way of looking at this and not seeing it as just, you know, fixing people was the important part of that. So for me, it was a declaration of a new way to go about this work at that time.
Mm. Mm. Do you think we suffer from diversity fatigue?
I think that I think particularly post George Floyd, there were people who made some decisions that did things that weren't really well thought out. It was coming a lot from people's pain, and you know, and I think it contributed to the backlash reaction that we're having. But I do think it's important for us to recognize that this reaction, these attacks on DE&I, are politically motivated. I mean, this is something that happened. You know, the justification for them lately has been the Gaza, protests and demonstrations and the anti-Semitism. But I was attacked back in 2020, years before that ever happened. So, you know, by people on the right. So I think what you've got people who've decided that the status quo, that is, the power of white people, is something that they think is important to keep in society, and things that take away from that are dangerous and threatening, and who want to stop the work for that reason. And unfortunately, some of the stuff that happened post George Floyd gave them ammunition to work on. So, for example, I had somebody who called me, who I've known for many years, professionally. We're not friends, but professionally known him for many years. And he's always been on the liberal side of these issues, pro-civil rights, pro-LGBT rights, etc. And he shared with me, he said he had a stepchild who at the age of 12 wanted to transition. And he said that he completely supports if that's their path, and he worries that 12 years old is too early for a child to make that decision. And he was sort of, betwixt and between about those two feelings, right? And he shared this with some younger members of his team, and they virtually canceled him.
Oh.
Called him a transphobe, said he was a bigot, because he was concerned and asking a question, that doesn't help. It just doesn't help when people act that way. I mean, I think we've got to get off of our righteousness on all sides of this conversation and realize that our righteousness is actually what the real enemy is. That righteousness is the enemy. And the more we can get off of our righteousness and remain a little bit open to at least try to understand where people are coming from, we've got a much greater chance of bridging that divide. And it's not easy. I lose my temper just like other people do. I try to maintain it, but there's sometimes you got to back away. You got to say, you know what, this is a conversation for me to be in.
We're human beings. Our righteousness is the enemy.
Yes.
That's well said.
There's a new quote for you to use.
Yes. Thank you for that. Jake, is there anything that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you?
I appreciate the question. The truth is, I don't think so. I feel like we sort of covered the stuff that's important to me. Spend more time in communities, spend more time with people you love, expand the definition of what people you love looks like, and then go love more people. That's kind of my MO. And it's really a treat to get to do this work in such a way that has the thing that's most important to me get to align with the things most important to my father, and such that we can create this body of work together that gets to have him contribute in the dwindling years of his active contribution to his career and in the budding years of mine. So it feels it's really cool to get to carry the legacy. And it's really an honor to get to have conversations like this, in particular with people who hold him in such high regard. The truth is, my whole life is filled with such people, but particularly in moments like this, it's really special to get to reflect on that other people are inspired by this work in the way that I have oriented my life towards. Feels like an affirmation and acknowledgement that I'm on the right path, which even when the heart knows that, it's still always good to hear. So I'm really grateful to get to be here, and for the invitation to be a part of this conversation.
You're welcome. It's great to have you here. And I find it fascinating that you're introducing also AI and bias to the conversation. And I am looking forward to following this and seeing where this will lead to, because AI is part of our lives these days.
It certainly is, and it's not going anywhere.
I was going to say, and for the future, right?
Yeah.
And for the future.
Yeah. Ibrahim, can I leave people with one thing that's really important that came out of this research? And I think it's something that
Go
really
ahead.
helpful
Go
to
ahead.
us. Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, we've all seen these bumper stickers, you know, practice random acts of kindness. And, you know, it feels like some old 60s thing. They should have peace signs up around it or something. But the reality is, we've got some new research that's been coming out over the last couple of years that shows that when you do take the moment for a random act of kindness, saying hello to the toll taker, asking them how their day is, nodding at that person on the street as they walk by, you know, these micro behaviors, that it not only is nice for that person, but you actually get a hit of oxytocin yourself. That when you do things like that, it will lift your spirits, it will make you happier. And so what I would leave people with is, we always have that moment. It's a little bit like that famous Lauren Isley story about the star thrower, which people I'm sure have heard. You know, that guy goes up on the beach and he sees somebody. It looks like they're dancing on the beach, but when he gets closer, he realizes the person is reaching down and throwing these starfish, which have been washed up by the tide. He's throwing it back in the water, and goes over and says, "Why are you doing this?" He says, "Well, if they're left out in the sun, they'll die." And he throws the guy, and the guy looks to the left and right. He says, "There are hundreds of them here. You can't possibly think you're making a difference." He picks one up and says, "Made a difference to him." And so every act of kindness, every act of consideration, every time we stop ourselves and find that humanity in ourselves and reach out to connect to humanity, the other person, it's like putting another stone in the other side of that scale. And that's something that every single one of us has an opportunity to do every single day of our lives.
Beautiful. And this was actually going to be one of my last questions. I'm going to ask it, but you have to come up with a different answer, because you already gave me one.
Okay.
And that is, and this question is also for Jake, of course, and that is, if you could give only one piece of advice of all the knowledge, all the books you've written, all the books you've read, your experience, you could only give people one piece of advice for a better, more meaningful life, what would it be? And I'll start with Jake, if you're ready.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if I were to boil it down to very, very simple, love others. Just love others. But to take it up to one sentence, you know, Gandhi said, "Be the change we wish to see in the world." And I think that, at least the way that I've always related to that in my life, is it feels like a lot of pressure. And my orientation to that is slightly different in the world around me. And it's very similar to what Howard just noted about making one little piece of difference, which is, sure, be the change you wish to see in the world. But I think more importantly, in a world that feels overwhelmingly scary and increasingly so every day, be the good that you need to see in the world. You know, if it feels like we live in a world where there's not enough kindness, bring kindness. If it feels like we live in a world where there's not enough generosity, bring generosity. You know, because it's true. I think most people orient to the starfish thing as every starfish we throw is just a tiny bit and doesn't really make a difference. But, you know, the truth is that actually every little bit of difference gives even just, if it gives even just one person faith in humanity, that's the good that most of us need to see in the world. So, take on the change as it feels appropriate, but always be the good that you want to see in the world.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would say, Ibrahim, I would say my advice to people would be slow down. So much of this, what we're talking about happens because people live in reaction. We're like those old things of the ping pong balls on mousetraps, when one starts and pretty soon everything is reacting. We've become reaction machines. And if we just slow down, the breath can be really helpful. Take a look inside. What's the next best appropriate step for me? You're not always going to make the right one, but at least you've got a much greater chance than if you're just a reaction machine. And I think that in today's world, it's especially important also in terms of slowing down, that we disengage at times, particularly from these machines that we've got carrying around all the time, and give ourselves a break. And there are a lot of people who are starting to take a Sabbath day from machines, which is really interesting. And I've started to play around with that a little bit, taking certain breaks for times, even for a couple of days at a time. So those are a couple of thoughts.
Be the good you want to see and slow down. Gentlemen, Howard and Jake, thank you so much for this conversation. I could go on for another 2 hours.
Yeah, so could we.
I think I could too.
Been totally fun. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you so much, and please come back. And Howard, you've inspired me a lot, and I don't think you have an idea of how much you've inspired me to not only keep going and talk about these difficult subjects, but also to bring more awareness and to keep fighting, because I think that we can talk about diversity, we can talk about trust, inclusion, and bias, and it's difficult sometimes, it can be messy, but I think if we have the right intentions and if we see the good in other people, then we can achieve beautiful things. So please continue to inspire people, continue to do what you do. And Jake, I wish you all the best. I'm excited and I will follow your work, and I'll make sure to read your chapters as well. The book coming in June, Everyday Bias, the new edition.
We'll have to get together again after the new book comes out, Ibrahim.
Please come back.
Will do. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your words. I can't tell you how much it means to me. It really means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
All right.
You
You
too.
too.